Hello. I'm sorry I can't be with you today, but unfortunately I've not been able to get up from Exeter. My name's James Pope, and I'm a senior climate scientist at the Met Office. My main work, the bulk of my job, is working with the UK climate projections, UKCP, which were most recently released in 2018, although we've added some bits since then, and they're known sort of colloquially as UKCP 18. The UK climate projections are a range of projections that cover climate models, statistical projections, and observations of climate and sea level rise. We've got loads of information available on the Met Office web pages. So if you do a quick search on Google or another search engine for Met Office and UKCP, you'll go there. And we've also made all of the information freely available. You can access it for the UK through our user interface, which again you can just pop into a search engine, and these projections are used by everyone from UK government down to individual members of the public. Away from sort of the data curation part of my role, I got two sort of main bodies of work. Firstly, I've been looking at using a weather forecasting tool to investigate how our weather patterns change, the relationship between the high and the low pressure around the British Isles in the future due to climate change. And the second work, I've been using storylines as narratives to help people to engage with understanding future climate change. That started off with a little fun project just to turn UKCP data into a weather forecast, working with Aidan McGibbon, one of our broadcast meteorologists, who presents this forecast for 2050 and then takes us through the data that we use to make the forecast. More recently, I've been working with my colleague Lottie Woods, who wrote a blog as part of the Met Office news page, and then also was involved in our climate conversations on YouTube, where they talked about the impact of climate change on British sporting events. And we've got more work in this space coming. But in the Outer Hebrides, I've been able to do a very special project using this sort of storylines approach, but also combining some of the weather patterns work I've done. I've been really grateful to work with a great range of people. Obviously, today I've been brought into this through Brian and his team at Climate Hebrides. But the other work I've done is, with the Outer Hebrides Community Planning Partnerships Climate Change Working Group, but particularly Matthew Logan and Kathleen MacDonald at Community Energy Scotland, Alicia Matthews at Anne Lantair, Kathleen Milne, who was at the Western Isles Libraries, Eleanor Pratt and many of the others at Sniffer, and of course, most importantly, Sandra Kennedy, a local artist. And we created these pieces of music, which Sandra has called Thule's Gale, and you can find them on SoundCloud, either through searching the internet, or as there's a link here as well. And hopefully, have these slides be shared or made available to you through Climate Hebrides. So that's sort of a little bit about me. But how about this project I'm speaking about today? The great work that's been done with Sniffer and across your community, the Our Climate Story. And I really think this is a fantastic piece of work that's been put together to sort of get into and understanding the ideas and the concerns that people across the Outer Hebrides have about climate change. I was incredibly impressed by the amount of response. I've got 210 contributions, and it's a really good spread throughout the Western Isles and throughout the different islands, because as I've come through the work I've been doing the last sort of 3.5 years, it's really been stressed to me how different in places the different localities are. And I thought that was a spectacular array. Of course, this is called Our Climate Story, and it is your climate story, but it is also ours, where the ours is the rest of the British Isles. And I've just plucked this map out from the figure. This sort of highlighted some of the key concerns around climate change, the flood, erosion, and drought. And across the whole of the UK, these are making headlines already. And I grabbed some just off the BBC website. So this is looking at Norfolk and sort of the role of coastal erosion. And you can find many stories around Norfolk, but also down where the Met Office is down in Exeter and the coast near us, where stormy weather, rising sea levels, and things like that are all combining to sort of add to the existing pressures on our coastal landscapes. These are more cliff-based compared to the Outer Hebrides, but ultimately the same impact is down the road, that there is a loss of land, and this could lead to the loss of property and the loss of culturally important sites. back in the spring, there was many talks about the role of heavy rain, flooding, and this was an example from from farming, that the amount of waterlogging that occurred just due to the volume of rain made it very hard for farmers to get out and plant. And there was much reduced crop yields as a result. And it was a very common story in the news. If you think back to sort of March, April, May, and a lot of stories. It was particularly bad through sort of what's sort of around the M4 corridor, that sort of swathe between Bristol and London across the south of England. But there were issues at other places as well. Looking at droughts, well, down where the Met Office is here is in Devon. Devon and Cornwall spent much of the end of 2022 and a good chunk of 2023 in drought. All the reservoirs for much of that period of time were well below where they should have been for that time of year. And there were hosepipe bans across much of Cornwall because of this. So these different effects are all being reported in different regions, but other regions across the UK perhaps aren't seeing any or even all of these impacts as of yet. So while the Outer Hebrides is not unique in this respect, one of the things that really jumps out when you look at our climate story, when you consider the islands, is actually that an awful lot of these broad range of different impacts, flood, erosion, drought, storminess, things like this, are all being felt across the community in a relatively small area. And that's not as common across the rest of the British Isles. So while this is our climate story in terms of the entire of Britain, it very much is your climate story for how it's impacting on all of you. And I thought it was important to sort of to draw that out. It was something that I felt when I went through it. I also wanted to pick up a little mention of storms. This has been a big part of the work I've done in the Outer Hebrides. And Section 3, they picked out that the types of weather related to climate observed events. And storms was top of the list. This was the one that people most responded to. And it's a big impact and a big risk in the Outer Hebrides, both in terms of erosion and flooding and those associated impacts, but also in terms of the impacts it has on different communities, such as the fishing community. Part of the work I did, we went through and looked at the weather patterns, these balances of low and high pressure. The lows are in the blue in these figures and the highs are in the red, and low is where you get your stormier conditions. And the 6 weather patterns that I've picked out here are sort of the ones that are most associated with the wettest and windiest weather on the Outer Hebrides. The mean total of these patterns in a winter, in your average winter, is about 22.4 days. So that's on average, you'll see these patterns. And they don't always bring severe weather, but when they occur, they're more likely to bring the wettest and windiest weather. And when we took the UKCP ensemble and we looked at how these weather patterns change going forwards, and in a low emission scenario, one that's similar to about the Paris Agreement of keeping warming to about 1.5 degrees, 1.6 degrees, something around that sort of space, you can see that by the 2050s, we increase the occurrence of patterns by about 1.1 days on average through the ensemble. But by the end of the 21st century, actually, there's no real change. There's a bit of redistribution. Some of these patterns become more likely, others become less likely. But ultimately, these 6 patterns, there's no real change. You compare that to a high emission scenario where we see about 4.5 degrees of warming around the globe. And you can see that by the 2050s, it's up to 3.7 additional days of these patterns on top of that original 22.4. By the end of the 2090s, you're looking at 8.8 days, which means you have over 31 days per winter, December, January, February, usually around 90 days. On average, 90 days of winter, you'll see around 31 of those days associated with these weather patterns. So it becomes quite a significant change in that high emission scenario, particularly when you compare it to the low emission scenario. So we don't know exactly where the future will go, and that will very much depend on the contributions and the emissions of greenhouse gases going forward, particularly over the next decade or so. And that will really determine how we end up. But you can see that for the Outer Hebrides itself, there is a real difference in how the end of the 21st century looks in this particular metric, looking at storminess. But one of the things that has always struck me throughout all of the work I've done in the Outer Hebrides is that there's always been this what I call Hebridean positive. And we're just going back to that opening slide I took from the Our Climate story. And it's this bit here in the red box, 54 solutions. The Our Climate Story had 54 responses which talked about different solutions, protecting wildlife and the environment, looking at the residents, community, the networking around that, how people can come together, and then also sort of, keeping things alive, local knowledge and skills, and utilizing them. When we did the workshops associated with the Toolis Gale music pieces that Sandra produced and the workshops that Sandra and the team designed, we got people to gather around, similarly around a map, and to put down information and things they wanted to engage with. We did an in-person version and an online version, because this was also back just sort of as COVID restrictions were starting to end. And it was interesting how there was a real focus on the social aspects, family, friends, vulnerable community members, which comes out across here in the climate story, the unique flora and fauna about that wildlife and environment. So focus, interest in this area, but this real drive, not just to say, this is a problem, this is a problem, this is a problem, but to go, here's a problem, here's a solution. So people have talked about the risks of communities becoming cut off because of power lines failing, things like that. So how about having community-focused power generation, so solar panels and wind turbines? People were trying to find ways that they can make sure that the communities were secured and giving a solution to a possible problem. And something that's always jumped out at me across this work. And you can see it here again. This is just some of the solutions that were talked about across roads and infrastructure, the energy, wildlife, food. And I thought this, for me, is a really important part of the Our Climate Story. It really highlights that there is a problem, there is a risk. Climate change will have impacts and probably already is having impacts on the Outer Hebrides. But through working together as a community and bringing out those sorts of local strengths, there's this ability to actually sort of help the island find solutions to the problems that are faced. And I think that's a really important bit, the positivity. To find the positive within the negative is really, really important and really heartening. And I was really pleased to see that section. I'll finish there, and as I said, hopefully these copy of these slides can be made available, and there's a selection of links to things I've talked about, whether that's the research or the different videos and things. I really hope you do go and look for Sandra's pieces on SoundCloud. If you've not listened to them before, they're really good. They're all about 10 minutes each, and they're just this beautiful combination of the climate data that we turned into music, field recordings of the sounds on the islands, but also the voices of the local community talking about how weather and climate impacts them. And I would really hope that you're able to at least go and check that out. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you enjoyed the rest of your day.